Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Front Page. My name's Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. Today we're going to be talking about an education initiative that some of you may have heard about or read about in the papers, the Regional Education Districts, sometimes called REDs for short. With me here in the studio here at GNAT today are two gentlemen who are working with 4 mountain towns, Peru, Landgrove, Weston, and Londonderry, who are looking to form a RED, or Regional Education District. And they're going to tell us a little bit more about what's involved with that, what they are going through in particular, and perhaps some of you who don't live in those communities may find that interesting and something that you may be thinking about doing in your own communities. But first of all, let me introduce Mr. Wendell Coleman, who many of you may know, who was a state representative from Londonderry and Windhall and Jamaica and that district over there for about, 10 years or so during the 1990s, and has also been serving as a member of the RED Study Committee for those 4 towns. We also have Mr. Doug Friant, who is a member of the Floodbrook School Board and also the finance director for the school.
Yep, that's correct.
All right.
It's good to be here.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming over today and to tell us a little bit more about this. Like I was saying, there's been a lot of conversation about it, and in fact, our last guest here, our last show was Armando Villaseca, the Education Commissioner, and we got to talk a little bit about regional education districts or REDs. But just for the benefit of folks who might have missed that show or maybe might have forgotten a little bit about that, why don't we start off with the most basic issue? What exactly is a RED, or Regional Education District? Wendell, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, in simplest terms, it's a union school district,
which
most people understand what a union school district is. A little bit more technically, however, it is a unified union school district, which simply means a union school district that is responsible for K-12 education.
Okay.
REDs are just a version of that was created by the legislature a year ago last spring in a bill called Act 153 that gave some incentives to get towns to form unified union school districts, and it's a little bit looser because in our case, our 4 towns have a union grade school, Floodbrook Union School. And the plan would be that the students from those towns would still go to Floodbrook Union School. Each of our towns is a school choice town, and our children pick where they go to high school, and the towns pay tuition within the parameters they pay it. Once the RED is formed, the local town boards in each town will cease to exist. Technically, the Floodbrook Board will cease to exist. All of those being replaced by a single RED board, which is under the law responsible for K-12 education. But the 9-12 part of it would still be handled by school choice. And so from the standpoint of a citizen in the town, not all that much is going to change.
Okay. Now, the important thing that a lot of viewers will want to know about is that this requires a town vote. Each one of the 4 communities in the proposed district will have to pass this at their town meeting in March.
Correct.
So that's the first hurdle, I guess, you're going to have to get over. But let me ask you, what was the attraction? Why did this seem like a good idea for you folks at the time? Is this driven by financial questions, or is it more of an educational thing here? And Doug, maybe as a finance guy, let me turn to you, and you can talk a little bit about the monetary implications of that.
Well, I think there are 2 driving forces behind it. I mean, the idea is to improve education. The idea is always to improve education. But there's also a great incentive to the taxpayers to do this. Now, there's a couple of different incentives to think about. One is the state would like school districts to consolidate, and they would like that because right now we have 5 school boards. 4 of them don't operate a school, they're the town boards. And they all have budgets that have to be developed. They all have to work with the supervisory union. They all have to have accounts that are audited and managed and so forth. And really the town school boards, their primary mission is to set tuition rate for secondary education and make sure the bills are paid. Other than that, they just don't do a whole lot. So it makes a lot of sense to consolidate all 5 of those boards together into one board that has representation that's similar to the Floodbrook board. So all the towns are represented according to population. And the state would very much like that to happen because it saves a tremendous amount of administrative costs. And so the state is offering a tax reduction for 4 years. The first year there's an 8-cent reduction, second year it's 6 cents, third year 4 cents, 2 cents until it finally sunsets.
Okay.
So that's kind of the gift that the state's giving us.
That's like 4 cents, 3 cents, 2 cents off of a property tax rate?
It's off of what the rate would be in that given year.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily going to be less expensive than this year if, school expenses go up, and it seems like they always do. People's property taxes go up, and we pay more. But from that more, we get a reduction.
Okay.
So that's the one side of it. The second side is very important, and that's that by all grouping together, we can save our member towns from going into penalty, or what's called penalty. So if we spend 125% of the statewide average to educate a student, we spend more than that, we're charged $1 more for every $1 more that we spend. So we're hit twice. By consolidating, we'll be able to spread those extraordinary costs over a broader base and hopefully keep some of our member towns out of penalty. And that's really the incentive, is to level the field, group together as a larger unit, and get that economy of scale.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, those 4 towns, Londonderry, Peru, Landgrove, and Weston, would leave the current supervisory union that you're presently in, which I think is Windsor Southwest?
Correct.
And then would come over and join the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union. I guess I'm just wondering, why is that step necessary? Is that, why couldn't you simply have a regional education district and stay within Windsor Southwest?
Well, the state would have probably allowed that. We would not have done that for some technical but very important reasons. Unless there is a special, I'm going to loosely use the term waiver by the state board, supervisory union voting is set up on the following formula. Any school board that operates a school, in our case Floodbrook Union School, gets 3 votes on the supervisory union board. Any board that does not operate a school gets 1. We have 4 town boards. So if we all voted as a cohesive unit, we would have 7 votes on the Windsor South West board at the current time. If we formed a red, 5 boards would disappear to be replaced by 1 board. We would have 3 votes in there.
Okay.
Now, if we move to Bennington-Rutland, by the way, I'll just point out we will have 3 votes too, but there is a huge difference. And the difference comes in 2 forms. One, we are school choice towns for high school. Bennington-Rutland has a lot of school choice towns, and there is no public high school within the boundaries of Bennington-Rutland. So we would be joining a like-minded community. That's very important. Okay. Whereas at Windsor Southwest, there is a public high school within the district, and we've been sort of a geographic and philosophical outlier ever since about 1960, to be honest with you.
Okay.
The second thing is that there is no single entity within Bennington-Rutland that has a large number of votes. We would get 3 votes, Manchester has 3 votes, Dorset has 3 votes. If you look at Paulet and Rupert, well, they're part of union schools, it's a little fuzzy who gets what, but it's roughly, each entity has about equal voting weight. Thus, there has to be a partnership among people to run the supervisory union. In Windsor Southwest, the way it is fell out historically, there's a public high school in Chester, where the supervisory union offices are located. There is a union high school, which is public. There is a union elementary school. Chester has a town board. Chester's got a lot of voting clout there, and they are very different than us. We could not have seriously thought of eliminating our boards and our vote without moving to a community that was more philosophically aligned with us on education, and where there are no giants in the room.
Okay. Well, I heard earlier today that the State Board of Education has given its blessing to your initiative, so you've got that that step covered. I'm assuming the BRSU is looking forward to having your regional education district in as part of its team. I guess I was just thinking, to kind of back up, walk us through the process. What initially inspired you guys to think that, gee, you know, this provision for a red under Act 153 here sounds like a good idea that would really work well for our communities? Was there something that struck you about that when that first came down that made you go, hey, let's take this to the next step?
Well, it just makes sense. I mean, every way you look at it, it makes sense. The mountain towns are very like-minded. I've sat on the Floodbrook School Board now for 5 years, and I have never heard anybody talk about their individual town. It's always about the school and how we can best provide for the students. And the idea of having 5 different boards just seems a little bit crazy. I mean, we're all like-minded people. We all want the best for our kids. And there's a great desire, or I don't know, many members of the community like the idea of sending their students to BBA for their secondary education. It's very important to them, and we hold all of that in common. So it's just one of these things that makes perfect sense, and not only that, the state's given us a tax break, and not only that, when we consolidate, we have this ability to save money.
So let's put that all together. It sounds pretty good then.
But I would say that we didn't get the bright idea. I can't take credit for that. The state passed a law that allowed reds, that wanted reds, and instructed each supervisory union to at least take a look. So the idea, in all honesty, didn't come from us. Our town boards got these instructions. They looked, they formed the committee that we sit on with a dual charge. One, to study the formation of a red, and 2, to look at moving supervisory unions. So we agreed to serve, and we have been busy for a year.
How many students altogether would be involved in this red if it were in effect now? I mean, are we talking a couple hundred or more than that?
I think there's, well, I don't have the numbers in front of me. There's roughly 200, between 250 and 260 kids that go to Floodbrook.
Okay.
Numbers that I'm very versed in. For the surrounding communities, I think there's about 100 secondary students. Wendell can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe between secondary and early ed, that's the number. So it's around 325 to 350, but I honestly have to check that because I'm not positive.
I thought it was about that, but when I totaled up some numbers last night from data out of the presentation, I got almost 400 total.
Oh, okay.
But I'm high school and grade school students. But
right, and that might be early education students also, because the red will provide for, or can provide for early education, and will provide kindergarten through 12.
So I guess one of the big questions that you may get asked when you go around at town meeting on March 6th and hope to sell this idea to your various constituents is the whole notion of how does this impact a very sacred principle in Vermont education, local control? I mean, historically, towns have set a high value on the idea of kind of being in charge of their educational destinies, and on the surface, this sounds like this is a bit of a blurring of that. Are you concerned that there are going to be some residents at town meeting who are going to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? We're going to lose control over our education budgets and stuff like that, or do you have a good answer ready for them?
well, we've certainly heard that there are concerns, and they vary from town to town, about the loss of local control. And I certainly, as a person, can sympathize with that. I will say that although I agreed to serve on this committee, and when I make that agreement, I try to go there with an open mind. It was a skeptical open mind. I'm not inherently a consolidator,
Right.
and I value local control. But I've also served 18 years on a school board, and I know that local control is not quite as much control as we often think. It has been whittled away year after year a little bit. With the passage of the same law, Act 153, that allows and encourages reds, another part of that law, and it's being phased in right now, is taking away a great deal of local control and is moving much of the control that we inherently think of having at our operating school boards, in our case Floodbrook Union School Board, and moved it to the supervisory union, where we are a majority faction. Excuse me, where we are a minority faction. So I would argue that if we sit and do nothing, we are going to lose a huge amount of local control. If we form the red and move to Bennington-Rutland, under the law, we lose the same amount. The way I word it is we will have more local influence because we will be joining a like-minded, much more like-minded community and a community, i.e. the supervisory union, where no one entity has overwhelming voting power.
Okay. So the other question that comes to mind then with this is the school choice question. I mean, what happens when you have a resident in one of the 4 communities there and they say, well, this is great, I understand the big picture, but I think I'd still like to see my kid go to the school in Chester. Is that possible, or how would that work?
It's absolutely possible for students that are in high school. For students that are in grade school, it's exactly the way it is right now. K through 8, the students would go to Floodbrook Union School unless the parents wanted to send them someplace else, and then the parents would be responsible for that cost. But for high school, there's absolute choice. The red articles indicate, now the red board has to be formed before we can actually start setting tuitions, and there is no red board yet, there's a study committee. Okay. But historically in the community, the tuition has been set very close to the BBA tuition. A couple of towns average it with Green Mountain's tuition, but that's a historical way of going about it. And the red in their articles is interested in following history. Let's put it that way. I think, is that fair enough to say, Wendell? So, so that amount of money could be spent at Green Mountain in Chester, it could be spent at Leland and Gray, it could be spent at BBA, or it could be spent at an approved private school, an approved independent school. As long as it meets state standards, then the parents can pretty much send their children where they'd like to go.
If I could add one thing to that, I think there is a lot of commonality in the 4 communities. However, there have been small differences in the way the 4 towns do their tuition and transportation expenses. In Londonderry, there has been a tendency to say we will take a block of money and we will provide that much money to any student wherever they go. There's been a little more tightening in some of the other communities, and I know this is a concern, but I would like to raise the possibility that they were forced into the positions they take in the last several years because they were always trying to stay out of penalty in the state funding. As we spread this out into a bigger unit, they can get away with that. I think we've been able, even though we're in penalty for other reasons, but in Londonderry, I don't think we've been so concerned because we have a somewhat bigger population. The red will have a much bigger population, not only because it's 4 towns, but because the high school students and the grade school students will be viewed by the state as one population and not separate ones. So I think there is more of a perception of a difference there than perhaps there really is. And then I would also like to stress that although pretty overwhelmingly for many years now, the majority of the mountain town high school students have gone to BBA. Mm-hmm. We are school choice towns. And very personally, I support school choice overwhelmingly. I had the option, I went to Leland and Gray. My son had the option and went to Green Mountain. My daughter had the option and went to Burton. I support school choice.
You covered all the bases then, huh? Well, let me ask you this. So what are the technicalities then, or describe for us what's going to happen if you go to town meeting and all 4 towns endorse this proposal? What happens next? Is it all set and on September of 2012 you've got this thing up and running, or is that the following year that this all takes place?
Well, technically what happens is as soon as the vote takes place, June 30th is a school year's end. So everything ends on June 30th and starts on July 1st. At that point, the red board exists, but there's a transition year. So all the 4 town boards still exist. And the town's board's mission is to close themselves out, finalize their business, And the Reds Board's business is to start everything up, get the transition to BRSU going, get the transition out of Windsor Southwest going, create a budget and all of that. But the board is not technically running the schools or the secondary education for a year after the vote.
Okay.
And so the flood board would still remain in existence for that 1 year and run Floodbrook Union School.
Okay, now let's suppose one of the 4 communities votes no. I know you don't want that to happen, but just on the hopefully off chance that one of them does say, well, not really, where does that leave you?
Well, as someone who's dealt with votes before, I never count them until they've been cast. But in the end, if this red is going to form, and if we're going to get the chance to move to Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union, we have to get, each individual town has to have a positive yes vote. Now, it is possible that one or more towns could vote no on town meeting day, and that their citizens, as in any Australian ballot vote, with a certain number of petitions on a petition, depending on their population of the towns, could force a revote, which could change that no into a yes. But in the end, all 4 towns have to approve, or this idea is dead.
Okay, so if one town did say no the first go around, it's not like you're going back to square one. You still have the positive vote in the 3 other towns in this hypothetical example, and you just have to get that 4th town to come on board.
That would be correct.
Okay, and then you can keep on going from there. I was just wondering, as we're talking, it struck me, is this the kind of idea that really works best in small rural communities like the 4 we're talking about here, or is this an idea that would work in larger towns, let's say Manchester or Dorset or places like that, or are there just some peculiarities to this that would make that maybe not quite so feasible?
Well, if this happened, this would be the first red that would form in the state. There have been several reds that have tried to form up north, and they've all fallen apart. And they've fallen apart because one town voted no. We're somewhat unique in that these 4 towns already operate a school together. Mm-hmm. So we've been working together for years on a common base. So really all we're talking about doing is bringing the secondary education into the fold. So we have a very good opportunity to pull it off, where maybe some of the other towns were thinking about closing schools, and that scared them, or they were thinking about, well, they actually would lose some local control, where now our town boards, really what they do is set a tuition rate very close to each other. So we're not dispergent in that way at all, a little bit, but we're very like-minded. And I think that's why some of the other reds have failed, because they had bigger issues, and they hadn't been working together for years and years, as these communities have.
Okay. Now, will you be holding any sort of information sessions or information meetings with in each of your 4 towns that would give those voters there an opportunity to kind of hear more in detail and ask you questions and all that? Or is it basically going to be a case of trying to communicate through school boards and what have you?
No, we're having informational meetings. Doug, if you the ones you've got on the top of your head?
Well, the one I have on the top of my head is Londonderry, because that's going to happen tomorrow night. That's happening on the 25th.
Right.
And then the other meetings for Weston, Peru, and Landgrove, I believe, happen later in the cycle. Now, one interesting thing that we were very worried about, and I don't know if we've confirmed this yet, but the vote is on town meeting day. And it was our understanding that we weren't able to talk about it on town meeting day, except we just got a notice from the Commissioner of Elections, the State Commissioner of Elections, who said that for candidates, you can't discuss the vote on the day of the vote. But for situations like this, where it's a ballot question, we can discuss it at town meeting day. So that's very positive. I was kind of dreading the thought of going to town meeting and having to zip my mouth and say, I'm sorry, I can't talk about this. So fortunately, it looks like we may be able to, and that will be another opportunity for information. We're also talking about holding an informational meeting the night of Floodbrook's annual meeting, and that will be very helpful because the annual meeting generally draws a large support from the community, and it's well attended, and it'll be a good time to explain the issues and let people ask questions.
Will this be by like an Australian ballot or a voice vote on the floor? Or?
By law, it's Australian ballot.
Okay.
Not only the vote to form the red is Australian ballot, but the first time around, even though in general we're not Australian ballot towns, the red directors have to be voted on by Australian ballot. They will be voted on at the same time, and those who are interested in running for this should get a petition signed with either 30 names on it or 10% of the checklist in your own town, whichever is less. So in our case, it's usually less. And that needs to be filed with one's town clerk on or before the 30th of this month to get your name on the ballot. The plan for the red written into the articles is that going forward, they will be elected off the floor of town meeting as we traditionally have done. But
And how many directors will be on this red board?
It'll be the same proportion as the Floodbrook board. So there'll be 1 from Landgrove, 1 from Peru, 2 from Weston, and 4 from Londonderry. Now it has to adjust according to the census numbers every 10 years, but the reality is that the census is pretty stable in our 4 towns. Except for declining population of students, we have declining enrollment. That's starting to look up again. We're starting to get a few new kids in Floodbrook, so that's good news.
All right. Well, gentlemen, good luck, and thank you both for being with us here today to talk a little bit more about this, what sounds like a very interesting and exciting idea, and it seems like it's one creative way to get around this whole idea of consolidation and trying to kind of cut some costs out of the education budget, which I know is a big political question statewide, really. The governor is, I know, interested in trying to see if we can save some money there, and so just about every politician I think I've ever talked to. But trying to make that happen is a very difficult thing when you're trying to, balance the interests of students versus taxpayers. It seems like trying to reach that golden middle is a bit of a challenge.
That's right, and the great thing about this is it's a win-win. The taxpayers have an advantage and the students have an advantage, and that's the wonderful thing about the red.
And also, because this is 4 towns, I would like to point out that Weston has an informational meeting on the 1st of February. They have another one scheduled on the 15th of February. Peru has one on the 23rd of February. Landgrove will do it at their town meeting the night before regular town meeting day. And Weston has one very early in March, also scheduled.
Now, should one of the folks in any one of those 4 towns not be able to make one of those meetings, is there a phone number or an email address where they could try and get some more information from, or how would that work?
The easiest place to go is go to Floodbrook's website.
Okay.
And under committees, there's a red committee tab, and under that, there's a frequently asked questions tab. And if you click on that, all that information that we've talked about tonight is there. And also there's contact information. If people have further questions, they can contact any of the committee members and get those answered.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you.
Doug Friant, Wendell Coleman, members of the Mountain Towns Red Committee. And I think we'll all be hearing a lot more about Reds and regional education districts as the acronym goes. Down the road, and good luck, and we'll be looking forward to hearing about your progress.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, and thank all of you for listening. This has been The Front Page on GNAT. My name is Andrew McKeever. It's been a pleasure being your host today, and we'll see you the next time around.